Hello, this is episode number 5 of the Martial Podcast. I'm Mark Jacobs, a martial artist, martial arts journalist, former contributing editor to Black Belt Magazine, and I tell stories about martial arts, which is what I'm doing with this podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about a few different topics, a couple of which may not be too popular for some listeners to hear about, but since I'm not being paid by anyone to do this podcast, at least not yet, maybe one day, I have the leisure of being able to talk about whatever I want, and hopefully you listeners, even if you don't agree with me, can still appreciate I'm giving my honest opinions here and not just trying to curry favor with people by telling them what they like to hear. And maybe it will even give some of you a little food for thought and make you reconsider where you stand on certain issues. So on last week's show, I talked with Ellis Amdor, which was a very interesting conversation on a lot of topics. And if you haven't heard it, you might want to give that a listen. Ellis is one of the most experienced and senior practitioners of classical Japanese martial arts in the United States. And some people may have wondered why I wasn't referring to him in a more respectful manner as Sensei Amdor or Shihan Amdor or any of the other titles that are commonly used nowadays. Actually, in Japan, I guess it would be Amdor Sensei. In any case, I didn't use any of those honorifics when talking to him, and you might be wondering why. Well, first of all, Ellis is not my sensei. We've never actually gotten to train together since we live on opposite sides of the country, though we've been talking about doing that for years, and hopefully one day our logistics will align to make it happen. That aside, I am not really a big believer in titles to begin with, and I prefer to keep this show more laid back and informal, which suits my personality better. But most importantly, Ellis doesn't go around expecting everyone he meets to call him sensei or master or any other title of this sort. Now, I know people in martial arts love titles. Love them! They come up with all sorts of really outlandish titles for themselves. Renshi, Kyoshi, Hanshi, Soke, Saiko Shihan, Grand Master, Grand Patriarch, Lord High Grand Poobah, and a million other things. And many of them not only love for people to call them by these titles, they insist on people calling them by these grandiloquent terms. And not just their own students, they'll expect other people's students, or other instructors, or complete strangers to refer to them this way. And I know a lot of listeners who may use titles like sensei or sifu and expect their students to always refer to them this way might be saying, well, it's just the traditional way of martial arts to show respect and honor your teacher, etc., etc. And in some cases that might have some validity, like if you're an adult teaching children and you're trying to teach them to always respect authority figures, though the term coach would probably work just as well. But if you think having adults continually bow to you and call you something like master every time they run into you on the street is just following tradition, you should consider what people like Ellis and Mike Skoss, who we also mentioned last week and is another one of the senior-most practitioners of these ultra-traditional Japanese Koryu arts, consider what they do. While they sometimes will ask people in the dojo to refer to them as sensei and not something more impressive like O-sensei or Dai-sensei, outside the dojo their students are on a first-name basis with them. They don't demand or expect that the students venerate them or anything like that because that's not really how they were taught by their teachers in Japan. And keep in mind, these are people who practice some of the most ancient and traditional martial arts in all of Asia. So if they're saying it's not necessary for everyone to always call them sensei, let alone something even more impressive, other martial artists might want to stop and consider just what is required by tradition. Really, most of what we now call tradition in martial arts, at least in the Japanese martial arts, and to be honest, almost all the other martial arts in Asia have imitated the Japanese martial arts to some extent when it comes to creating a hierarchy and titles and ranks and such. What we now call tradition was created in the years leading up to World War II when the authoritarian, essentially fascist Japanese government back then wanted to create a generation of young people who would blindly follow orders and die for the emperor, or really for the leaders claiming to represent the emperor, when they were told to go die in a war someplace. The older Japanese styles, not to mention Okinawan karate, for the most part didn't have all the fancy titles or the belt system that venerated rank or any of the militaristic discipline you now see. And some of the more impressive titles like Soke and Shihan were almost never used back then by people in Japan. Even today, titles like Shihan are meant to be written, not spoken. Almost no one refers to themselves or other people out loud as Shihan, except in America. I'll also point out that the very best martial artists I've been around in my life didn't give a good goddamn about titles. Gene LaBelle, who, when he was alive and still involved in martial arts in the 1990s and aughts and even into the 2010s, besides having been one of the greatest martial artists who ever lived, was senior in terms of experience to just about every other martial artist on earth in his later years. He'd been involved with grappling and martial arts since the late 1930s, so for well over 70 years he'd been doing this stuff. And you know what people called him? Gene. I went out to a restaurant with him once, and someone recognized him and came up to him saying, "Oh, Master LaBelle, it's such an honor to meet you, Master LaBelle." And the first thing he said to the guy was, "It's Gene. Just call me Gene." And he was the same way even in the gym. White belts could come up to him and call him Gene, and he didn't care. And Rickson Gracie, who I've said on the show before was one of the most phenomenal martial artists I've ever seen, had nearly superhuman grappling skills. And you know what everyone called him? Rickson. And Eric Top Dog Naus, who people may know helped found a group called the Dog Brothers and has done more full contact weapons fighting than maybe anybody on earth, and I would say is probably the deadliest person I've ever seen at close quarters with short range weapons. And everyone, the people that train with him, everybody, they just call him Eric. Or maybe Top Dog if they're being a little more playful. But the reason these guys didn't ask people to call them by any fancy title is because they didn't need them to. A lot of times in martial arts, people want to be called by these titles because they need everyone to know they are supposedly expert martial artists. And often that's because many of them deep down know that they're not really all that expert. They're not really all that great. A lot of times people hide behind these kind of titles to mask their insecurity. Guys like Gene and Rickson and Eric, they didn't need to have their greatness affirmed by a title. They knew how good they were and were confident enough in their skills that it didn't matter to them what people called them. So, if people of that level, who are not only senior to most martial artists out there, but almost certainly are far more skilled than just about any other martial artists out there, if they don't want to be called Super Senior Sensei, Imperial Grand Master of the Universe by their own students or anyone else, then who should be called by these titles? Maybe no one. Changing gears here, in the news last week, the UFC settled an antitrust lawsuit filed by a number of former fighters that had been going on for years. They settled for $335 million, which may sound like a big win for the fighters, but considering there were thousands of fighters affected by this, it may not amount to that huge a payday for any of them. And that $335 million is a drop in the bucket to the UFC. In fact, stock in their parent company went up around 5 points when news of the settlement was announced. Essentially, the fighters suing the UFC were saying the UFC is a monopoly who unfairly dominate the mixed martial arts business market by eliminating competing companies, which is bad for the fighters since they don't have any serious alternatives to offer their services to. And because the UFC doesn't have any real rivals, they can pay these fighters what they want to, and it's take it or leave it. And for the most part, that's all true. Yes, a big superstar like Conor McGregor has some leverage to get more money out of them when he negotiates a deal. And a fighter like Francis Ngannou, who had the potential to go fight big money boxing matches, could walk away from the UFC. But the vast majority of fighters don't have that kind of leverage or those kind of options. So they're stuck probably not getting the full value of what they're worth. And the fighters who were part of this antitrust lawsuit had said they wanted to change this situation, but ultimately they chose to just take the money and not do anything to really make things better for the fighters, which you can't blame them for too much. I'm sure some of them probably need the money, and having a few $1,000s or whatever it is in hand sounded better than waiting another few years and maybe ending up with nothing if you lose the lawsuit. But to me, this was really one of those situations where what was good for the fighters, not to mention what was just fair and just, may not have been good for the sport, or at least not for the fans. It does seem on the surface of it, the UFC is, for all intents and purposes, a monopoly. If you're going to start naming the 100 best fighters in the sport right now, probably at least 90 of them fight for the UFC. So yeah, that seems like a monopoly on MMA. And while that's bad for the fighters who don't have good alternatives to make money with, it's not really bad for the fans. Because if the UFC was like boxing, with all the top fighters being champions of a bunch of different organizations, being promoted by a bunch of different promoters, and being shown on a bunch of different TV networks or streaming services, you'd almost never get to see the best fighters fight each other. In boxing, it only happens once in a blue moon when top fighters aligned with different groups actually meet each other in the ring. Say what you want about the UFC, but for the most part, they give fans the fights they want to see. I say for the most part because occasionally, with really, really big fights that fans would have been thrilled over, they don't make those matches. I'm thinking back a few years when there was talk about George St-Pierre moving up in weight to fight Anderson Silva, or Silva himself moving up in weight to fight John Jones. Now, those would have been just epic fights that every fan of the sport would have loved to see. But the fighters themselves were reluctant to do those fights. I think both GSP and Silva were reluctant to risk moving up in weight to take on such tough opposition. But the UFC could have easily made those fights if they really wanted to. And they could have made them by just throwing enough money at the fighters that they'd have been happy to take the risk. However, from the UFC's perspective, even though those would have been huge fights and all the fans would have wanted to see them, they wouldn't have made as much money as with some other fights because they'd have had to pay the fighters so much to do it. So that's a case where the boxing business model might have been better for making those fights because superstars in boxing have more leverage and can earn a bigger part of the total revenue that comes in from a fight. If a fight grosses $200 million, both fighters could say, I want $90 million to do that fight. And maybe they each get that amount and the promoters just get $20 million. But the UFC isn't going to pay any fighter $90 million for a single fight, so GSP versus Anderson Silva or Anderson Silva versus John Jones never happens. Like I said, though, for the most part, they do give fans the fights they want to see, and if all their champions and number one contenders were scattered among 3 or 4 different organizations, you'd virtually never see those fights. And the sport would probably be much less popular than it is now. So ultimately, what's fair and just for the fighters, who are really the essence of the sport and probably deserve better treatment and better money, in a way, what's best for them is not what's best for the fans, and you could even say not best for the sport itself. just look at the mess boxing is in nowadays, and you can see how there are some benefits to a monopoly, at least for the fans. The next topic I'm going to address here may be unpleasant for some people to hear about. To tell the truth, it's not something that's pleasant for me to talk about, but it's something that rarely gets discussed in most martial arts circles and really needs to be. This week, Joel Gingery, a jiu-jitsu instructor and world champion from Florida, was convicted of raping one of his students. Last week, Andrew Sherry, described as one of the most senior karate practitioners in Great Britain, was convicted of sexually assaulting several former teenage students. 2 weeks ago, Raymond Zeiss, a karate school owner in New Jersey, was sentenced to probation after pleading guilty to sexual contact with a student suffering from cognitive and developmental disabilities. And that same week, a mixed martial arts coach in Illinois appeared before court to begin the process of his trial for criminal sexual assault and sexual misconduct with a minor. 3 weeks ago, a martial arts instructor in Maryland was indicted on multiple charges of sexually abusing minors at his school. This is just in the month of March. Are you seeing a pattern here? Though some of you might say these are the exceptions and it's just a tiny number of bad apples that I'm paying too much attention to, I would say while this sort of behavior may be the exception and not the rule among most martial arts instructors, it happens far, far more often than anyone in martial arts cares to admit. Having written about all sorts of martial arts related news topics for a number of years now, I scour news sources for any significant stories relating to martial arts. And I can honestly say hardly a week goes by, and never a whole month that goes by, without me seeing a story about martial arts instructors somewhere being arrested or charged or convicted of some type of sexual abuse involving a student, usually an underage student. If you do martial arts and don't think this is a problem that needs addressing, you are simply not paying attention. And I would suggest this is definitely one of those situations where, if you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem by burying your head in the sand. At this point, I've probably reported on this issue as much as just about any journalist on earth. And that's not because I have done a huge amount of reporting on it, but rather very few people write about this at all, in martial arts or outside martial arts. Really, with just a very few exceptions, a couple of MMA sites that do occasionally devote some space to this, and the social media poster McDojo Life, who does do a good job covering this issue, no one else in martial arts regularly addresses this. The only place you do frequently see these stories are in local news outlets where it's only covered when it involves a martial arts instructor from that local area. Otherwise, you see nothing about this nationally. And because I have done some consistent reporting on these incidents, not in any depth, but just in short news briefs in the past for Black Belt Magazine's website and elsewhere, I've had people who have been victims or people who represent the victims of this sort of abuse contact me on a few occasions, wanting me to tell their stories. Unfortunately, I have never been able to find a serious outlet to tell this story in a larger format that would really address the issue. I've tried several national publications and never got any interest at all. In the past, when I was still regularly working for Black Belt under their old ownership and editorship, I suggested a major feature story on this topic of how martial arts instructors sexually abusing their students was a real problem in the industry, and it was rejected outright. The feeling was they didn't want to make martial arts look bad. And when I was contacted by the new ownership last year, and we had a discussion of what direction they wanted to take the magazine, this is before they basically killed the magazine outright. One of the first things they said to me was, "We don't want to do negative stories." And writing about martial arts instructors abusing their students, I guess, would qualify as a negative story because they felt the magazine should be positive and uplifting for martial artists. Now, the owners, the editors of Black Belt or any publication can print whatever they want. They're the owners, they pay the bills. But for someone like me who has a degree in journalism and has worked as a journalist for some significant newspapers and magazines over the years, this is pretty much the exact opposite of what any responsible media outlet should be doing. Personally, I believe in the sentiments of the famous newspaper man H.L. Mencken that it's the job of the press to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. What it is not the job of journalists or anyone who professes to be involved in journalism to do is to act as cheerleaders. If there is a problem in martial arts, I view it as my job to let people know there is a problem, whether they want to hear it or not. And there is a problem here. There's a website out there called The Truth About Martial Arts, which I don't particularly agree with their agenda. The person running the site seems to be very anti-martial arts, which I am obviously not since I've been doing martial arts most of my life and still do them. But the site is still worth considering because they list over a 37-year period 338 martial artists in the United States alone who have been found guilty of abusing underage students. And obviously, those are just the ones who have been caught and convicted. There are probably a significant number who have not been caught. And these are just the ones convicted of abusing underage students. It doesn't even address the issue of martial arts instructors sexually abusing their adult students, which is also a real problem, particularly for adult females in some martial arts schools. A few years ago, upon reading a story about a martial arts instructor who was caught abusing several of his underage students after having been accused of the same thing years earlier and fleeing the country only to return and do this again, I suggested in something I wrote at the time that, at the very least, states should mandate background checks on any martial arts instructors or assistant instructors who teach children. Now, this is done in many states for any adults who work at public schools or daycare centers, and many martial arts schools nowadays do essentially serve as de facto daycare centers. After school, they're filled with little kids as young as 4, and that's basically how a lot of these schools pay their rent now. So I can see how this idea might not be popular with some martial arts instructors who do not abuse their students, but still think it would be an extra hassle or an extra cost for them to deal with some state background checks. But I would ask, is that extra bit of hassle or cost to you really more important than trying to do something, even if it probably won't have a huge impact on solving this problem? Is it more important than maybe keeping just 1 or 2 kids from ending up getting sexually abused? And if you are a martial artist who does care about the industry you're part of and would prefer it not be associated with sexual predators, then I'd suggest the best way of keeping it from being associated with this sort of thing is not to try and hide the problem in the hopes no one will notice, but to get the problem out there and start to eliminate the sexual predators from the ranks of martial arts instructors. And the way you do that is by first just getting it out in the open and making everyone aware of this. Like alcoholism, you can't solve the problem until you admit there is a problem. But no one in martial arts seems to want to do that. Lastly here, I saw a video recently of a mail carrier being attacked by some guy in the street, and I couldn't really tell what led up to this. It seemed like angry words might have been exchanged beforehand, and then the guy tried to sucker punch the mail carrier who dropped his mail, and the two squared off, posturing like they were going to box in the middle of the street. I didn't bother watching much more because I don't usually pay much attention to these kind of street fight videos, since I have no interest in seeing people who can't fight very well fight each other. And I know there are some people who make a cottage industry out of examining these sort of incidents when they're caught on video, and they sometimes provide some useful analysis for self-defense purposes, but I've seen enough real violence over the years to be aware of what it looks like and how to be on the lookout for it that I don't generally feel the need to watch much more of it on YouTube. But it was the lead up to the incident where the two men seemed to be in some sort of conflict beforehand that got me thinking. And I have no real idea what was said or who was at fault, though you probably shouldn't try to sucker punch a postman who's just looking to deliver the mail. But it did get me thinking about an incident that happened to an old training partner of mine. When I was still a teenager doing karate, I became friends with this guy in the class who was about 20 years older than me, and we became pretty tight, and I got to know his story a little. He'd grown up in the South Bronx in New York in the early 1960s, and the South Bronx has always been a pretty tough, dangerous neighborhood. Back then, there were street gangs and all sorts of rumbles going on between them, like in West Side Story, except without all the singing and dancing. And this friend of mine was part of a gang as a kid and got into a lot of fights and just had a real rough and tough upbringing, like a lot of kids from that neighborhood. But he turned his life around and ended up becoming a social worker, which is what he was doing when I knew him. And at one point, he was working for a company that sent social workers on home visits all over New York City. This is in the early 1990s, at the height of the crack epidemic. And people now worry over how dangerous things are and complain about how much crime there is, but they forget 30 years ago, the murder rate in New York was more than 10 times greater than it is now. So if you were alive then and weren't completely panicking over crime, you probably shouldn't be panicking over it now. That's not to say there is no crime problem now or people shouldn't take crime seriously, because there is and they should. But people should also try to keep things in perspective. Anyway, my friend worked for this company that sent social workers on home visits throughout New York City, and a lot of these were to some not very good areas. And when one of these assignments to someplace like a housing project in Harlem or a tenement building in the South Bronx would come up, all these nice, well-meaning, do-gooding young social workers would say, "Oh no, not me, I'm not going there." So, because they knew my friend was a bit of a tough guy, had grown up in those kind of neighborhoods, and did martial arts, they basically sloughed off all those assignments to dangerous places that no one else wanted to take onto him. And he told me one morning they were doing their daily assignments for where people should visit that day, and they had a home visit that needed to be made for an elderly blind man in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. And at the time, Fort Greene was basically the murder capital of New York. And this was when the murder rate in New York overall was at an all-time high. So you can imagine Fort Greene was definitely not the place you wanted to be spending your afternoon back then. And no one in this office of nice young social workers wanted to go there. Everyone kept saying, "No way, I'm not doing this. No, I'm not going to be the one to go down there." So finally, just to get the meeting over with, my friend said, "Yeah, fine, I'll do it." And he drives down there to Brooklyn and finds this decaying old brownstone walk-up apartment building in Fort Greene where the client was living. He goes to the outside door and buzzes the apartment number to be let into the building, but no one answers. And he knows the guy is elderly and blind, and he thinks maybe the guy might be hard of hearing as well, so he buzzes a few more times, but still gets no answer. Now he's starting to worry a little. Maybe something happened to this guy since he knew a social worker was supposed to show up at this time, but he's not answering. So now he has to get in there to do a welfare check and make sure the person's okay. And he does what any good New Yorker would do when they want to get into a building. He buzzes every apartment until someone finally buzzes back and lets him in. So when he steps into the vestibule of this building, he immediately smells some kind of funny odor he can't quite place. Suddenly, an apartment door to one side of him opens, and a guy steps into the doorway holding a butcher's knife in one hand and a baseball bat in the other hand. And my friend is hit by this overpowering smell coming from inside the apartment, and he recognizes what it is. It's the smell of crack cocaine, and he realizes they're running a crack house out of this apartment. And the guy in the doorway with the butcher's knife in one hand and the baseball bat in his other hand is glaring at my friend and shouting, "What are you doing here? What do you want?" Now, what my friend told me was that in his experience on the streets, people like that, very violent, often criminal individuals, in those kind of situations, expect people they confront to act one of two ways. They expect them to either be afraid or they expect them to react with hostility. What they don't expect is for the person they confront to be polite and treat them like normal human beings. It's outside their frame of reference. And when you treat them that way, it throws them off. They don't know what to make of it. So all my friend did was give this guy a nice smile and say, "Hi, how are you?" And according to my friend, the guy was so taken aback, he actually smiled back at him and said, "Oh, I'm fine, thanks." Then my buddy immediately, still nice and friendly, says, "I didn't mean to bother you. I'm a social worker just paying a visit to someone upstairs. You have a nice day." And the guy with the knife and the bat said, "Okay, you have a nice day too," and went back inside his crack house. My friend went upstairs, the client was okay, and that was the end of it. Everything turned out fine. Now, that's a situation that could have gone in a whole different direction if my friend had handled it the way many people would suggest. A lot of martial arts instructors, a lot of self-defense instructors might have advised immediately running, which in many cases is the right move, but inside a cramped brownstone hallway with all the closed doors all around you, that might not have worked out very well. And a lot of experts might have advised a much more aggressive approach, maybe pulling out a weapon of your own at that moment. And sometimes that might be the right call. But remember, if my friend had been carrying, say, a firearm and had pulled it out when this guy with a knife and bat confronted him, besides the fact that might well have escalated the situation, think about his justification here. Say this guy took a step toward him waving his butcher knife and my friend shot him and the guy falls back into his apartment. How does that look to police or a prosecutor or a jury? They could easily say my friend gained access to this building under false pretenses and then shot someone when they were in their own home. Regardless of whether this guy was running a criminal enterprise out of there, it was still his residence, and my friend didn't have any law enforcement powers, so at the very least, he would have been in for a very unpleasant legal experience, which might have even culminated in jail time. And that's a best case scenario where he wins the actual fight. So instead of always thinking about confronting aggression with superior aggression when it comes to self-defense, people might occasionally want to think about just being a little friendly. I know it won't work in every circumstance, and there are certainly situations where you might have to resort to sheer, brutal, overwhelming force to protect yourself. And when that time comes, you have to be able to recognize it instantly and be ready to just go after that guy with everything you've got. But before it reaches that point, you might want to consider just trying a little human kindness. Or, as that great philosopher, the late Patrick Swayze, said in the original Roadhouse movie, be nice. until it's time to not be nice. And that wraps it up for this week's show. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode where we're scheduled right now to have as a guest the author of the book American Shaolin and of the best-selling Bruce Lee biography, Bruce Lee, A Life, Matthew Polly, who'll tell us about his time living at the Shaolin Temple and all about the life of Bruce Lee. As always, I want to thank the Black Swan, Eleanor Academia, for providing the great music to tonight's show. You can find a link to her website down in the show notes, as well as a link to my own website. Thank you for listening, and as that old sensei of mine used to say, keep punching.